Hello, everyone, and welcome to Full Steam Ahead. We are so excited to start our presentation for you today. We'll go ahead and go to our slideshow. We'll introduce ourselves. So we'll go to the next slide. The name of our presentation is Full Steam Ahead, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But if we go to the next slide, I am Julia Smith. I am a museum and early learning specialist at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center.
Hi, I am Meredith Osborne, and I'm also a museum and early learning specialist at the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center. We can go to the next slide, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about the Smithsonian Early Enrichment Center, which we call SEEK. So SEEK is a full-time school serving approximately 135 students, infants through kindergarten. We're actually housed within the Smithsonian, and we use the Smithsonian and our community, which again is made up of museums, gardens, and the National Mall, for our object-based approach. As we go through this presentation, I encourage you to think about what spaces can be useful resources in your community for this approach. So you can think about the grocery stores, or the post offices, or the meadows, or the basketball courts, really whatever is around you. We believe our approach can be translated to almost all environments. So we use the museums because that is our community to find objects, but you can find objects and community everywhere. Our team, the Office of Engagement, which right now is me and Julia, we support the school and the educators in creating their curriculum and their content, and we also implement outreach programs. A couple core beliefs that we believe in. So we believe in guided learning and not giving answers, but helping children discover their answers by harnessing their natural curiosities. We also believe children are capable, and Julia is going to talk more about this later in the presentation, but we believe children have the capacity to learn complex subjects when presented in a developmentally appropriate way. And lastly, we try to embrace our families and our children and embrace and implement an anti-bias education in our practices to work with really everyone, the families, the children, each other, the public. So that is SEEK in a quick nutshell. And you can go to the next slide and we will talk about our objectives. So today we are hoping to present with you why we add arts to STEAM, so that's science, technology, engineering, and math, and why we think you should too. We're going to consider what STEAM skills children need to be successful now and in the future, and observe a lesson that was developed to foster those skills. So what we're really asking here is, how can we create lessons and experiences that foster STEAM skills? We're going to recognize how to capitalize on children's innate STEAM ability. The question we're asking here is, are children natural scientists, and how do they conduct experiments at different ages? And lastly, we're going to show you how we incorporate the scientific method into lesson planning. And the questions we're asking there are, can we as educators act like scientists? And can we utilize the scientific method when creating our own lessons or experiments? Go to the next slide. So STEM in early learning, in early childhood, is a classic. These are classic things that early childhood educators teach. So we may have a lesson about science where we look at the life cycles of frogs or butterflies. We might talk about the water cycle and learn about how raindrops fall from the clouds and how evaporation works. We learn about the oceans. For technology, I've personally taught lessons on robots, simple machines, tools. For engineering at SEEK, we talk a lot about architecture. We also talk about construction, including the very happy, always people like learning about construction vehicles. And for math, the classic lessons are shapes, sorting, and sequences. We can go to the next slide. So we'll pause for a moment here and just think about, why do we add the A? Why add the art? So STEM becomes STEAM. And at SEEK, there are a lot of reasons why we add this A, but some that we brainstormed were, it's an entry point, something concrete. Looking at art, something concrete, gets us ready to explore. It often gets kids excited and invested. It offers multiple touch points. By looking at art, you are being introduced perhaps to something new. This artwork being a place of focus. Obviously, there's this imaginative element. This is true for both looking at art and also making art. So if you're making art, you get to create and be experimentative, be imaginative. When you're looking, you can imagine yourself in a new place or a new scenario and potentially problem solve. Looking at art also gives us a potential for visual literacy, which is, as an educator, we can take the time to add language and explain a new vocabulary when children are looking at art to introduce new topics. And art can help children process and synthesize. Making art can help children process and synthesize, which I am going to talk more about on the next slide, which we can go to. Thank you. So we wanted to take a minute to talk about our belief that children should use process-based art. And for us, this means focusing on the play, the experiment, and the innovation as part of the creating process rather than the end product. And this example is a family day that we did with the National Academies of Sciences on the art exhibit Mathmalchemy. And here you can see the exhibit on the picture on the left, and then you can see the art project we paired with it, which children were given different tissue papers of different shapes. So there were pentagons and circles and squares, and we actually made a collaborative quilt, which is the last photo you can see at the beginning of our quilt, where each person made a patchwork, and it was supposed to celebrate the beauty and whimsy of math. Go to the next slide. While we are going to focus a lot on lesson planning and doing lessons in this presentation, we wanted to take a moment to note that STEAM in early childhood can happen all the time and can be embedded in your practice. So it does not always have to be your core lesson or even content driven, but you want to give children the time and the place to practice these STEAM skills rather than memorizing content. And one way we can embed it is just thinking about the parts of our everyday life. So if you take a class to go wash their hands and they have questions about perhaps what it would feel like to use soap without water, you can experiment and try it with them. That might not be a lesson that you've developed, but it's still giving them a lot of science, technology, math, and engineering skills. Julia is actually going to talk a lot more about these skills, so I'm going to pass it off to her.
Yes. So here in this chart, you can see some things that we have come up with as what we see as some of the foundational STEAM skills that children need to be successful, both as young children and also in the future as high schoolers, college students, and adults. So as you're looking and reading through some of these skills, I want you to think, do any of these feel specifically like STEAM skills, or do any of them feel specifically like art skills? And that is definitely a leading question because we absolutely see these skills as important to all of these different disciplines, because these are foundational multidisciplinary skills that allow children to formulate questions and find the answers. And so we've taken these skills and we've divided them into curiosity, communication, and analysis. Of course, there's going to be a lot of overlap between those. But we are going to, in our next few slides, go through and do a sample lesson using these skills as a framework of how we build our lesson and how we are really looking at these skills. And the reason we're really looking at these skills is because oftentimes, especially when you're teaching very young children, the actual content that you're teaching them may not be what they remember, but if they're gaining these skills, then they have the ability to find the answer to that question again in the future. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is a piece that we've used often for lessons before. And we're going to do a quick sample lesson for you, the two of us. I'm going to act as the facilitator of this lesson, and Meredith is going to be playing the role of a young child. And she's going to be giving me some responses that we might expect from a preschool student. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And the first thing I'm going to ask is, Meredith, what do you see?
Okay, let's see. I see people. It looks maybe like they are making things. Like I think that maybe because they're working with their hands. well, perhaps pretend I'm another child. I see really big things,
Mhm.
big, heavy things.
See those
Um,
types?
yeah, maybe that's metal.
Metal.
And I also see right in the middle of this piece, I see something to me. It's not moving. Like when I look at it right now, it's not moving, but it suggests movement. I see something that perhaps that looks like a pendulum that's going back and forth, or maybe up and down, up and down. But I see a machine perhaps that is moving.
Okay. So you see a lot of things. You saw some people making things. You saw some big, heavy machines that are maybe made out of metal. And you see something that might be moving either back and forth or up and down. All right. I am so curious about what is happening in this picture. So many things could be happening. I wonder what it could be. So we'll go to the next slide. So that was just a quick example of something that we often do with children in front of museum objects. We like to call it careful looking. We have them talk about things that they see and are wondering about a piece. And this helps kind of initially pique their curiosity. So we're going to move on now that we have a little bit of maybe of curiosity from Meredith. I'm going to ask some more questions and try to get at some more of these skills. So, Meredith, you said you saw some people making things. What do you think they're making? Could they be
Well, I think they're making something maybe big and heavy.
big and heavy? Yeah. You said you thought maybe you were seeing some big, heavy machines. Can you think of some big, heavy machines you've seen before?
Yeah, I've seen a lawnmower, a big machine, a lawnmower makes a lot of noise.
A lawnmower. Oh, it's really loud. Yeah. So for this lawnmower, how did it move? Was it a kind that you pushed or did you ride on it?
Mm. So at my house, we have a lawnmower that we push. Gotta push it up a big hill. It's so heavy.
So it
My
moves.
neighbor,
You are making
my,
the lawnmower move.
but my neighbors have the kind that people ride on and they go so fast. And I get to watch them out the window go so fast on the riding lawnmower. They just sit.
Okay. So for your lawnmower, it moves when somebody pushes it. That's how it moves. What about the riding lawnmower? How does that move?
Mm, I don't know.
I wonder. Let's look at their piece again. Do you see something here that looks like a riding lawnmower? You see something?
Oh, so I see maybe some wheel shapes, but I also way in the back, I see something that kind of looks like a car.
Sure. Yeah. Looks like a car. It looks like a car to me. I see some wheels. It looks a little like that riding lawnmower. How does a car move?
Car moves with wheels. The wheels spin and the car moves.
Car moves with wheels. Yes. But sometimes I see cars that are parked or they're stopped at a stoplight and they have wheels and their wheels are working, but they're not moving. So could it just be the wheels?
Mm, no, my family, they step on the gas pedal to make it move.
Could be the gas pedal. You step on the gas pedal. But sometimes if you turn the car off and you push the gas pedal, it doesn't move. But the gas pedal must be telling something in that car to move. What? How does a car move?
I don't know.
Think about it. So let's move on to our next slide. So we chatted a little bit. We asked lots of questions. So now we need to answer some of those questions. Inquiry is very important, but we also need to have some answers as well. So I'll say, Meredith, you actually spotted the part of a car that makes it move in the middle of our picture. Do you remember? What part was that? Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, that piece in the middle that looked like it was moving. I thought maybe it was moving back and forth like a pendulum.
Yes. So that is a part of a car's engine. Have you ever heard someone talk about an engine before? Yes, so an engine makes a car move, and the kind of engine in a car is called a combustion engine. A combustion engine. Combustion means fire and explosions. So cars move because of fire and explosions in their engine. Would you like to see how that works?
Yes.
All right. So we are going to be looking for 4 steps in how a car moves. So we'll go to the next slide quickly. So this is a little animation that we created to show you how a car engine works. Because if you're like me, before you did this lesson, you likely don't have a great idea of how car engines work. If we were doing this with students, we might show them an animation like this or use pictures to kind of get at some of this information. So I'm going to explain this, and I'll go ahead and have them start the animation. So first, all right, yes, it comes in, it pulls in the fuel, pulls in the gas, then it compresses the gas, then it lights it on fire and it combusts, and then it pushes out the exhaust after it's all burned. And those are our 4 steps. All right, so we've done some communicating, we've answered some questions, we've given Meredith some information, but now, the information is there, but it hasn't really been processed. So we're going to move on to our next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do we help children analyze and take in this information. And so we're going to show you an example. I don't want to walk it through with Meredith, that would take too long. So we have a video that we're going to show you of one way that you might help children really incorporate this knowledge through some doing, some spatial reasoning, some experimenting. So we'll go to the next slide for that.
Okay,
and we'll show you this video in just a second. So there's
intake, compression.
Yeah, so we'll show you this video. It's going to play 3 times. It's really fast, actually. And then I'll talk a little bit about what you were seeing. So we'll go ahead and play it.
Okay, last time. Ready? And play, let go. Intake, compression, combustion, exhaust.
Looks like
Okay, last time. Ready? And play, let go. Intake, compression, combustion, exhaust.
okay. So like I said, it was a little bit fast. So hopefully you were able to kind of see and get a sense of what was happening there. So they were acting out those 4 parts of an engine. They were, doing the intake, and they were compressing it. And they were using their bodies to act out those parts of it. And in doing that for children, especially really young children, is a great way to sort of start incorporating those parts. And this idea that they're a series and they happen in line and they have to wait for one person to do their part of it before they can do what they're doing. So we went through all of these steps in a really structured way, a really structured lesson. I was leading it and asking questions and had some very clear objectives, but this can happen in more free play situations as well. And Meredith is going to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So to get us started for watching preschoolers play an experiment, or watching them experiment during their play, I was going to have you watch this video. And when you watch it, I want you to ask yourself, what type of experimentation are you observing? So we can go ahead and play the video. So I'll take a moment to try and answer our question. What type of experimentation did we observe with these preschoolers during their free play? And for a little bit of background, this video was taken during the time, right after everyone's resting, there's no planned activities, and these were just materials that we had out in the classroom, and they picked them up and started playing. And when I watched this video, I noticed building. They were building structures. I noticed engineering. I noticed an experimentation of a child trying to balance a little ball on the top of that, like almost 2x4 block. I saw experimentation with angles, which angle got the ball to roll fastest and slower. I saw a lot of cause and effect experimentation. What happens if I start the ball at the top of the ramp? If I start it in the middle of the ramp, how far does it go? I saw different children experimenting in different ways at different times. And what I'm seeing, and what perhaps you saw, or maybe you didn't see, but if I walked you through it, you started to see, is not just us observing things. Scientists have systematically looked at children's play and realized they are actively conducting experiments. So one way they showed this was they would give children a toy they'd never seen before, perhaps a box that does different things when you pull certain levers, and they would watch children systematically work their way through this toy and experiment to figure out how it worked. In fact, children are more flexible experimenters than adults are, and they often are more like concrete in their experiments. Now, I think for some people, it's easy to see how preschoolers experiment. We're going to go to the next slide to show you a video of our infants experimenting. And in a moment, I'll have them play this video, but the question is the same. What type of experimentation do you observe? So we can play that video and think about that question.
Wait, you want to try?
You want Nick?
Put it up at the top.
It rolled down.
You get 3.
How many can I hold?
Go. How do we get to go? Oh. Ashley, look.
Ooh,
It rolled
Daisy.
down. Daisy knocked
You're
off
banging
some
on
of
the
it,
tube.
So I'll attempt to answer. The type of experimentation we observed can be a little bit harder to see infants experimenting. I think particularly because they are not experimenting with the experiment that I had set up. Those are my hands in that video with the egg shakers. They are not particularly interested in watching those egg shakers go down the ramp. But they have conducted, probably in that short 1-minute video, I saw like maybe 5 or 10 different experiments. You see them exploring what it feels like to pick up a lot of the egg shakers. How many can they hold? You even hear their teacher saying, how many can you hold? You see them knocking them together and seeing how that feels, knocking those together and bringing it up to their mouth to see how it feels to knock egg shakers together in their mouth. And this is a 1-minute video. And again, it's not just us who is observing their children as natural scientists. In fact, children have been observed to, like 15-month-olds, which is basically what this age is, have been seen to do more experiments in a 5-minute period than most scientists do in a week. And they're also really skillful analysts. Young children will show surprise when something improbable happens. So if you present them with a bunch of balls that are all red and a couple of white ones, and you keep picking the white one randomly, they get surprised. They're actually doing statistics and noting the statistics through their behavior. So they are learning about the world around them through experiments and analysis. We've talked a lot about how children explore their world, and they often ask a lot of questions in how they explore their world. And I'm going to pass it off to Julia to talk a little bit more about questions.
Thanks, Meredith. So yes, when children are exploring, they're often coming up with lots of questions that they ask the adults around them. If you've ever been around young children for any length of time, you have probably been asked a question that you didn't know the answer to, or maybe we as humankind don't even know the answer to. Things like, Is there life in space? Is definitely a very open debate and hard to answer. So how do we deal with these kinds of questions that children are likely going to ask you if you're engaging with them for any length of time? And I think a big one is that these ideas are coming from the children. Children are looking at the world around them and they're doing their job. They're asking questions. They're trying to figure out how it works. How does everything fit together? Why do things happen the way they do? And that is leading them to these questions. I think the second thing is a little bit difficult for some adults, and that's accepting that we don't know everything. I think that there's sometimes this idea that adults or educators or people in an educational higher role have to have the answer to every question. And that's just not realistic, particularly for educators. We have, very unique roles. You have very unique specialized knowledge in how to teach, how to engage children, knowing about what children need. If you work in school, licensing, things like that. We have lots of very specific information we have to be experts in. And it's not reasonable that you'll be an expert in everything. And so it's okay to not know everything. And by not knowing everything, you can then model for children how to be a lifelong learner. You can show them what it means to research. You can either research with the children or do some research on your own and bring it back to the children, but talk to them about how you had to do some research and learn a little bit. You can use resources. There might be other educators who have done a lesson like the one that you're hoping to do before, and you can learn a little bit from their experience. That's very scientific to build on other people's research. And then you can use your community as well. You can use other educators around them, friends that you might have, families of the children that you're teaching. And also the questions that children are asking are usually coming from the world around them. So you can ask community members who they might be observing about that question. For example, if children are wondering, where does the trash go? The best person to ask is the person who picks up the trash, who's a member of our community. So we'll go to the next slide. Another aspect of children asking really complicated questions is this idea that we think is really important, which is that children are capable. If they're capable of asking this question, it means that they're curious about this topic and they're capable of trying to understand part of it. There are plenty of people who might think that children can't understand certain complicated topics, but we think that really does a disservice to children to not even try. There are lots of ways to think about this. You can think about it in a developmentally appropriate way. Maybe the entire concept that they're asking about is a little bit too big for them to understand, but you can break that down into developmentally appropriate pieces and help them start to understand that. We can be responsive to what they're interested in learning about. What have they actually asked? What are they interested in? And really follow that interest. If they're interested in it, they're willing to learn about something maybe a little bit more complicated. We can make connections to what they already know. How can we connect this complicated topic to something that they're already familiar with, and build on that previous knowledge, and help them understand this unfamiliar topic that they're asking about? And how can we make this engaging and participatory? How can we make it hands-on, experimental? How can children really be constructing their own knowledge instead of having it handed to them by a teacher? So they'll really understand a lot better if they're engaged in constructing that knowledge. And we'll go to the next slide. So before we move on, we really want to talk a little bit about STEM and identity, and this could be its own entire presentation. But we want to acknowledge that STEM and STEAM are all fields that have historically excluded people, and that even today there are stereotypes about who succeeds and who is allowed to do them. And so it's important to be really thoughtful about who and what you're presenting in your classroom, and does it reflect those stereotypes? So thinking about, pictures and the people that you're studying, as well as what is considered maybe scientific knowledge and what isn't, that can be something as well, where, we can be gatekeepers about what isn't STEM or scientific. Something else to consider as well is that children notice things, and they might notice that there are people who are being historically excluded, and it's okay to talk about that with them. In fact, it could even be a disservice to pretend that the fields are different than they are. Children can understand these topics. We can talk about how things are not always fair. So we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about planning these lessons. So we talked about how children are scientists. They're following the scientific method. They're curious. They're interested. How do we use the scientific method and capitalize on that interest to not just have teaching moments, but build on that and create lesson plans? So we'll go to the next slide. Here is our kind of simplified version of the scientific method. And if you click, so the first part of that is research. We're always doing research with children. This can look like lots of different things, reading books and singing songs, but getting some background information. And then next, that can lead to the creation of a hypothesis. So we'll click and see some of the things that can look like. A hypothesis is just kind of getting questions from different places. Those multiple touch points that Meredith was talking about can all kind of spur different questions for children. We're in observation. Yes. So they're observing all of these things, and that's helping them formulate their questions and their hypothesis through conversations and inquiry. So next we test that hypothesis. So click through to that by kind of what we saw through their play, some experimentation that could be, very open-ended, that could be very directed, like a lesson. And then as you do that, you move on to refining your hypothesis. And this is something that we do at Seek. We follow an emergent curriculum, which follows children's interest. And Meredith will talk in a little bit about what that could look like as you follow children's interests when you are creating lessons. And I'll send it off to Meredith to talk about these things a little more in depth.
Okay, so this first step, research, this is a step that at Seek we do as educators alongside the children and throughout this whole creation of a lesson plan. So sometimes we will be actively researching with the children. Sometimes we go off on our own and we do our own research and present it to the class in a way that really interests them. For books, I personally love reading children's books and find them have great ways of breaking down complex ideas. So I often will read a nonfiction children's book, but I sometimes find that those books don't quite tell the story that I want to tell. Maybe they don't have the object that I want to be the focus of my lesson as a center. Maybe they don't go as deep as I want to go. Maybe they go too deep. So in addition to using published children's books, we at Seek often create our own books. We actually use PowerPoint, kind of like this, to format slides with words, which then we read to the children. And this is great for a lot of reasons. It gives us if something is complicated, if we're talking about a subject that maybe we're just starting to understand, it's so nice to have all the language typed out for us rather than having to ad-lib it in front of a class. It also can be passed on from person to person. We've started putting these books in our library, and other educators check out the books that our educators make. So if you look at this photo, the very first picture is a picture of an educator, Brianne, and she is reading a book that we made about the fungus that is attacking the Big Mike banana trees and causing them to go potentially extinct. And in that book, it talks about how bananas are reproduced through taking like a sprout of a banana. So there's not a lot of genetic diversity in them. It also talks about how we can help save the banana plant, perhaps by, in this story, we tried to say pollinators were really important, is really the goal of that story. Another thing we do a lot, and this is another thing where we might do a classic or made up example, are songs. Do a lot of singing at Seek. And singing is great because it allows you to say the same line again and again and again without feeling repetitive. And children need to hear the same thing again and again and again in order to process it. So for example, I'm just ad-libbing this right now. I'm just doing this off the spot from Julia's lesson. If I wanted to make a song about an engine, I might just sing a song like, the engine makes the car go, the engine makes the car go, hi-ho, the car, let's go, the engine makes the car go. In addition to songs, we often rely on experts. And in this photo, the second photo shows a picture of an inventor, a museum educator and inventor who is showing our children how to use a 3D printer. That is not something that we would probably be able to use in our classrooms at Seek, but the class was interested and we reached out and we were able to give them this experience. Now, when we work with outside experts, we often give them just a short one page about what to expect when working with very young children, because our classes are younger than what a lot of people are used to talking with and showing their ideas to. So we will say things like, they might ask you something off topic, bring them back, encourage them to ask questions to figure out what they know and what they don't know. We also will utilize technology as part of our research and also as giving children background information. So we are very thoughtful about our technology use. We believe that children should be active in the technology that we use rather than passive. But we also really think it can provide a truly excellent opportunity. For example, in DC during the day, it's very difficult to watch a rocket launch. But if we're talking about rockets, we might want to play a video of perhaps the Saturn V launching so the children can get an idea of what it looks like, sounds like, and in their minds feels like to see a rocket launch. We also, as another note, do believe that exposure to technology helps children understand technology in the future. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. This next slide is about how we work observation into our museum lessons. And we do that by using objects in the community. So for objects allow us to play and experiment. Again, we've talked about this. It gives us something concrete, like a painting. Here you can see our educator Maya is in front of an Impressionist painting at the National Gallery of Art. And the children are observing, they're looking at it. It can also give children something to explore and manipulate, like the toy that both of them are holding. This observation allows for making connections. It gives a framework. And it allows for children, which we're going to talk about in a second, to come up with more questions to further their learning. We also use the community. So in this example, the children are going to the wharf, which is near us in DC, and they're looking at actual boats floating in the water and perhaps starting to ask questions about why boats float as opposed to sink. We also believe that when children explore the community, they become part of the community and they have interest in the community. And that interest leads them to care for their community. And if you care for your community, you want to make your community a better place. So we often see our children really embracing the community that they're exploring and living in. If you go to the next slide. Next slide. Thanks. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So after looking at these objects and these community visits closely, we start to have a conversation. And through these conversations, we create a hypothesis. So this photo is of a young child, Anthony and I, and we are creating a hypothesis through observation. We are wondering what we see, what we think, what we wonder. And my job here as the educator is to really truly respond to the questions that they're asking, the conversation we're having, through validating their ideas, their thoughts, and their questions, perhaps asking follow-up questions, digging a little bit deeper, and trying to really understand what the child's saying. A child this age might say something that seems unfamiliar, unconnected to mountains, but then with a little bit more conversation, I'll start to understand why they're saying that connection. So it's really a lot of asking, responding, and waiting to give the children time to get their ideas out. If we go to the next slide. The next part of creating the hypothesis is really going back on inquiry. So children ask questions all the time. And why do they ask questions? Because something is unfamiliar to them. Or perhaps they've related something unfamiliar to them to something familiar in an inaccurate way. So it is our job as educators to address the question and correct any misconceptions or harmful thinking. We also wanted to take a moment here to talk about sometimes children ask questions that we just don't know the answers to, or maybe is not appropriate to answer in front of the whole group. And in that case, you can say, wow, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I need to have some time to research and explore before I answer it. Or you can even say to the child, that is a really interesting question. I want to answer it. Remind me when I'm done talking to everyone, and you and I can talk about it some more. We can go to the next slide. So in creating our lesson plans, we have to have a place to test these questions, test these hypotheses, and that is through experimentation. And at Seek, we experiment in play, like you saw in those videos, but we also might have an educator-led experimentation time. So if you see in the video, or sorry, in the photo all the way to the right, there are 2 buckets filled with water. One is blue and one is yellow. And up at the very top of the ceiling, there's a pulley. And the children are actually experimenting with several things, but they are experimenting with what happens if you pull a cup of the blue water out using the pulley, using that simple machine, and dump it into the yellow bucket. What color does it become? So that is an example of an educator-led experiment. For an example of a child-led or more free experiment are these 2 photos of the child with holding the fan. So here we were learning about wind, and we had a whole bunch of different materials like rocks and feathers and sticks and cotton balls and grass and dandelions, all different types of materials in a bucket. And we gave these children little handheld fans, and we had them observe which ones the fans could move. So you can see this child is actually, she's holding a rock. She's holding a rock and she's putting it right on top of the fan and noticing the fan is not powerful enough to move that rock. And go to the next slide. We also wanted to speak about playing, this testing of the hypothesis and playing while in a museum space or in the community. This can sometimes feel a little bit intimidating to actually play in a museum. So there's 3 different examples. 2 are outside, so it's a little bit easier to play. You can see our children cutting up a pumpkin in front of Kusama's pumpkin, and then actually playing with the sea lions, these other animals at the National Zoo. Those might be a little bit easier to wrap your head around. We don't have to worry about having them be quite as museum safe. We can use materials like food outside, but we also do play inside the museums. And for those, we consider the importance of like museum safe materials. So we will bring sensory bottles or bottles filled with the content that we want to explore and experiment with. So if we're learning about water, we might just bring a bottle of water that we don't open, but the children can push around and see how water moves. If we are learning about clay, I've brought Ziploc bags of clay. They don't open it, but they can still feel clay being cool and clay being manipulable. We also try and set safe parameters for play. So we might I work with infants and toddlers. I'll put out a blanket and I'll tell them, I put the toys on the blanket and I say, play as much as you want as long as you stay on the blanket. And then the nice thing about that is when it's time to go, I just fold up the blanket, put it in my bag and walk away. Cleanup is the easiest. So we really do believe that giving children safe parameters allows for play within the museum. And I do want to take a moment to talk about this very last photo, which is at the Smithsonian National Art Museum. It's a child ice skating, but you can't ice skate there. So she's standing on paper plates and experiencing the lack of friction of paper plates on the floor instead of using blades and ice. You can go to the next slide. So the last step of the scientific method is refining our hypothesis, coming up with new ideas. And we do that through our emergent curriculum. So as children ask us new questions, we develop new ways to answer and explore them. And I wanted to just go through an example. And this was not a 1 week. This was perhaps a month, but an example of how our curriculum emerges with time. So the children were interested in gardening. They spent several weeks on gardening. Moving on to the educators really noticed they were asking a lot of questions about the animals that dig. So the next unit they taught was animals that dig. From there, they started getting interested in underground construction, which then allowed for like a little bit more focus to pipes and utility lines. They opened up, the cabinets under the sink and they watched where all the pipes went and wondered where they were going. Then they went to mining. Of course, with mining, there was mining for gold, which caused them to talk about pirates. Learning about pirates made them think a little bit more about people. So they learned about archaeology, then ancient civilizations, and ended with ancient Egypt. So this is one way that we allow children to regularly refine and give new ideas of what they want to experiment with our emergent curriculum. And we can go to the next slide. This is the end. We tried to build in some time for questions, and we hope we answered these objectives for you. So hopefully we now have an understanding of why arts is added to STEM. We consider what STEAM skills children need to be successful now and in the future, and observed a lesson that was developed to foster these skills. We recognized how to capitalize on children's innate STEAM ability, and we incorporated the scientific method. We showed you how we incorporated the scientific method into our lesson planning process. You can go to the next slide. We invite you to keep in touch and to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our website, seekstories.com.
Yes. So we do have a little bit of time. So if folks have questions, you can put it in the Q&A chat. But we did have one question. They said, I would love to read more about the study of children experimenting. Can you post the link, please? And so we do have a link. I believe we found it in Scientific American. It's reposted from a Nature article, and it's from a study from 2011 from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Stanford. And one of the authors is Laura Schultz, if you'd like to look that one up specifically. But it basically follows kind of what Meredith was saying, was the way that they presented this toy to children, and they observed what they did with it and observed them using the scientific method.
Another really interesting researcher is Alison Gopnik. She's written several books, including The Scientist in the Crib, which I really enjoy. It talks about how young children are actively doing experiments as a way to understand their thought process. And for me as an educator and also as a parent, it gave me a lot of peace to think of the fact that my child, who was, throwing broccoli off the side of their high chair, was doing it initially to explore gravity. And then when that got boring, they were experimenting with my emotions of how I was liking or not liking them throwing the broccoli off. And it helped give me a little bit of peace of mind. But it's a really great book. She's written some other ones, but The Scientist in the Crib is probably the most in line to what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So we had another question that's looks like it's from Guadalupe Martin. It says, do you also incorporate the engineering design process? Which is an excellent question. So while we were researching for this, I did look up the different kind of methods of folks in engineering, technology, and mathematics field. And the reason we sort of gave that overview of the scientific method is because the methods they follow are all not exactly the same, but really similar, and do have all of those elements in common. This idea of research, hypothesis, refining hypothesis, and experimenting are all elements of those. And then we also, I think you can very easily see artists doing that as well.
Yeah, I was actually, with the interest in engineering, I was going to talk about a family lesson that we did that talks about, uses a very large sculpture that used to be outside of the Hirshhorn called Years Are For What? And we found pictures of that being installed. So we found photos of the crane helping to install the piece and the big trucks that came in. And we also discovered that the artist was really involved in, the installation of the piece. And we looked at how that piece was installed, and then we made our own mini installations, and we learned about welding. So we do actively teach and engineering principles as well. And we often do look at the art to help with those principles too.
Yes, and we are right about at the end, but we did have one last question, which was if we could repeat the name of the author, and I believe that's the author that you were talking about, Meredith.
Yeah, Alison Gopnik. I believe it's Gopnik. I believe that's right. There might be a C in there.
No, I think you're right as well. I have it pulled up. Right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We definitely hope that you keep in touch, and we really enjoyed putting this presentation together and presenting it for you all.